Hello, it's Belinda. I'm back today to share my second layout as the guest designer or one of the guest designers for the Mini Kit Monday Challenge group for January. If you have watched my kit share video, you would already know that January is my birthday month, and because I was invited to be a guest designer this month in January, I decided to use the opportunity to tell some stories about myself. So often we spend time documenting our family stories and our children's stories, but I think it's easy to forget that our own stories are important as well. So the three layouts that I'm sharing with my mini kit for January will be all stories about myself. I have got the first video up and I will link that in the top corner for you now if you'd like to have a look at that. But for today's layout, I am using these three very similar selfies that I took mid-2019 when I'd got home from a night out. I was feeling good about myself at that point, so I took a couple of selfies. And I'm getting a little bit deep with my journaling in this layout, so it is hidden journaling that I'm using, but we'll get to that later. So you would have seen at the beginning I had pulled out a few little bits and pieces from my kit that I was planning on using for this layout, and it is going to be a really heavy floral layout. I've done quite a bit of fussy cutting off camera, but I'm also going to try and do a bit of layering with some of these pattern papers just to get them all used up. I've trimmed that wood grain with the rose gold foil diagonal stripes. I've trimmed that down to 6x6 so that rather than it being a chevron, it's kind of more like a striped pattern paper. And then I'm going to use this black and white floral as the mat for my whole layout, but I want to save some of it because I will use it for matting my photos. So I'm just cutting out the center of that, or gutting the paper, and I think I'm leaving, for memory, I think I left about a 2.5 inch border around the outside because my layout is going to be on some basil white cardstock, and I'm not sure if eggshell is the texture or if eggshell is the color, but it's white basil and it's got like an embossed line through it. Now, I do apologize about the lighting in this video. I'm having a really tough time getting my lighting right at the moment. I can't really rely on the natural light coming from outside because it's changing so frequently. So I am using a little bit of additional lighting, but as you can see, it's a bit too bright here. So I've matted that white cardstock, which is it's now a 10 by 10 piece, 10 inch by 10 inch piece of white cardstock. I've matted that onto the floral background, and I've also run it through my sewing machine to add some stitching around the edge. Then I've trimmed this wood grain piece down to 4 by 12 inches, and that's going to be the band that runs across the page and is going to be the home for my 3 photos. So there's one of those florals that I have fussy cut out. These 2 floral pieces were on a piece of 12 by 12 pattern paper. And when I looked at the paper, I did think that what I was going to do was fussy cut them, and now they're going to serve as the top and bottom of my layout. So I have matted my photos onto some white cardstock to give them a little border. And now I'm just going to add a couple of layers of pattern paper behind them. So I'm trying to bring in a few different patterns and a few different colors, but trying to keep it consistent. So each photo is going to be matted on 2 pieces of paper. One will be a black and white piece and one will be some kind of pink piece, and I'm just changing it up. So this first photo has been matted onto that black and white floral. And then I've grabbed this really pretty pink striped paper, and that is going to form the second mat for that photo. And then while I was doing it, I did notice that on the back of this pink stripe were these really cute little sort of messy paint dots. And so I'm going to use that as the first mat for this second photo. And I'm just keeping the borders nice and fine, nice and straight, nice and even, because I do want my photos to sit straight across the page. And then I've grabbed this black and white script printed pattern paper as the second mat for that photo. I'm going to trim it down. And then for the third photo, I go back to the papers that I had pulled from the mini kit, and don't know if I want to reuse that paper, but what I end up coming back with in a moment is a softer pink and white diagonal stripe paper. So that's the first mat for that photo, and I'm going to trim that down. And then for the second mat, I will bring in that black and white floral again. Toy with using some of that script paper again, but it's, yeah, end up just going with the black and white floral. As I said, I'm keeping the photos lined up nice and straight across that band. In hindsight, I think it might have looked good if I had sort of tilted some of them a little bit just to give a little bit of extra interest. And I did play around with that while I was putting everything together, but it's not how I ended up going. I did keep them nice and straight. And just figuring out which photo I want to go where. And I am going to leave a gap there on the left-hand side because that's where my little journaling pocket is going to go, and that's also going to be where my title goes. So I've taken that wood grain strip away, and I have run that through my sewing machine. And then I've got some tissue paper, just some plain white tissue paper, and I'm going to trim that down to about 1.5 inches, and I'm going to adhere that to the top and the bottom of that strip. Now in the end layout, you don't end up seeing a whole lot of this tissue paper because I do add some extra border decorations to it, so you're not going to see it, but it is just to add a little bit of extra texture, something a little bit different, a little bit interesting. So I knew that I wanted to have this tissue paper nice and straight, and to make it easier for myself, I've just folded it over on itself a couple of times before running it through my paper trimmer, just so I'm not trying to cut through a really huge length of tissue paper. It's easier to just cut it down once it's folded over on itself. And because I did want it to add a little bit of texture, what I do before, I don't think I did it when I stuck this first strip down, but I pulled it back up again and started again. But what I do is I just take it in my hand, and hopefully you'll see that soon. I'm sorry that this lighting is so blown out. It's making it really hard to see when there's so much white on white. So I'm pulling that tissue paper off, and I'm just scrunching it up in my hands just to give it a little bit of extra texture. And then I'm going to lay it back down again along the edge of that wood grain band that's going down the middle. And I'm going to trim the end off. Do the same with the other piece, and you can see that now I'm just scrunching it up in my hand before I lay it down onto that strip of pattern paper. Trim off the end again and pop that down. I do put things down and bring them up and put them down and bring them up quite a few times on this layout. I did make a resolution at the start of the year that one of the things I was going to do was to just stick things down and to commit and to make it work. So I am trying to do that. Now I have this white cardstock that I've run through the Cuttlebug with a polka dot embossing folder just to give it a little bit of interest, and I'm trimming that cardstock down so that it's the same size as my matted photos because I do want it to be quite even across that middle band. They're fitting quite nicely now, but you will see that what I'm going to do with this photo on the end here is I'm going to add a little bit of interest, a little bit of extra interest to it because it is my favorite of the 3 photos. I know they look very similar, but I'm sure we can relate. We all have our favorites. So it is my favorite of the 3 selfies. And I just wanted to make it pop a little bit more. So I've got this, it was a square frame, and obviously that square frame is not going to fit on my rectangular photo. So I have cut it down the middle, and I'm going to add one piece of the frame onto the opposing corners of it. Obviously it doesn't meet up once it's adhered down. You can see the gap, but I don't mind. I think it's still a nice effect. It helps it to pop off the page just a little bit more. I quickly realised that I should put some plain paper down before I ended up with glue all over my photos and all over my layout. So I've just used the wet adhesive to adhere that frame to the back of the photo. And then I've used that same soft pink and white striped paper, and I've run it through with a decorative frame die. And I'm going to attach that, you can't quite see it there, I'm going to attach that to the back of this photo. So I've added some adhesive foam to the back just to prevent the middle of that photo from sagging down. And then I'm going to pop it onto this die cut frame piece. Now the problem with doing this, although I love the effect and I love that it's really highlighted that photo, it does add a little bit more width to the photo, which kind of messed up the placement of my photos and my journaling spot. So it isn't as nice and neat and straight as I would have liked it to have been, but I make it work. And in the end, I'm still happy with the way that it turns out. So I had a little bit of a pep talk to myself and reminded myself that my resolution was to just stick things down and to make it work. And I'm going ahead and committing to sticking these flower pieces down. And it works out pretty well with the flower pieces. I also go in a moment and I'm going to stick the band, that wood grain band, down as well. That is the one piece that I think I probably should have waited to do, because I knew that I wanted to add some more layers on the top and the bottom of that band. I really wanted to layer up the texture and the interest, and I put my double-sided tape far enough in to allow me to tuck things behind, but I didn't really take into account that I had the tissue paper down. So in hindsight, I probably should have done all of the layering on the top and the bottom of that band before I stuck it down. But again, I make it work. So I'm just checking to see where I want the band to go before I stick it down, because it is just slightly shorter than 12 inches. I'm not sure why, which of the papers is off, but it does come just inside the background. So I'm going to stick it down, and then I'm going to have to take it over to my paper trimmer and just cut the excess off. So what I'm doing is just cutting the excess off the tissue paper on one side of it first, because there was a little bit hanging over, and then I'm going to grab my paper trimmer. It was such a tiny amount. I probably could have left it, but I knew that it would annoy me, so I wanted it to be nice and straight, and I'm trimming that off now. Okay, so those bits are stuck down, and I'm ready to go and add some of the finishing touches. So like I said, I knew I wanted to layer up some extra pieces on the top and the bottom of that band, and the first thing that I do is I'm grabbing this is one of the papers that I fussy cut some flowers out of, and it had a nice green border strip, which if you have a look at my layout, you'll see the cluster of flowers at the top has got some green in it, and the cluster of flowers down the bottom has no green in it. So I just knew that I needed to add some green to the bottom of the layout to balance it out. So I've grabbed a border punch, and I'm not actually holding the paper all the way up to the edge because it is such a fine piece of paper. So I'm actually lining it up with the top of the cut, and then I've run that through, and then I'll trim off a strip of that, and that will go down on to the bottom of that wood grain band. Bringing it back, and I'm just going to tuck that in there. Not too worried about it right now. I'm just checking to see how it's going to look before I start sticking anything down. And then I have got these washi strips, which I thought about adding, but I think the pop of black was just a little bit too big, and I didn't want to cover up all the tissue paper that I'd laid down. So what I end up doing is just sticking with the punched border piece. And then I know I want to add another border onto the top, so I've grabbed that pale pink striped, diagonal striped paper and a different border punch, and I'm going to create another strip. And then in a moment, we're going to skip ahead a little bit in the video because I did inadvertently lose some footage. So it was nothing important. It was just sticking these strips down to the top and the bottom of that wood grain band, and then also adhering my photos down. That's all that was missed in the footage. But now I'm getting ready to work on that journaling in the journaling pocket piece, which is also where my title is going to go. And because I do have these 3 embossed tags that I'm going to put my journaling on, I know that I need to lift that piece off the page a little bit. So I've cut down some really thin strips of foam, adhesive foam, which I'm going to use, but I know that I want to stick down my title to this, and once I've stuck that foam on, it's going to be a bit bendy in the middle, if that makes sense. So I'm going to start adhering my title first, and I've grabbed these really pretty pink glossy thickers, and that's just going to say myself, and then I will come back in a little bit later with some letter stickers to finish off the title. So I was really, you can see I was fussing around with the placement of those because of the tail on the Y and the top bit on the L. I know they've got particular terms for those and I can't think of them right now, but yeah, it took a little bit of fussing around to figure out the best way to place those. So I've just nested the Y in on top of that, and I think that that works out quite well. Do a lot of fussing with this title, and I will come back once I've got the placement. Once I'm happy with the placement, I will actually come back with my wet adhesive and just add a little bit of wet glue behind those, because the paper is embossed. I want to make sure that it's adhered down really well. I just don't trust the adhesive on those thickers to hold on a textured paper like that. So here is those little thin strips of foam, adhesive foam, which I'm just trimming down, and you'll see that I'm only adding it to 3 sides because of course I want to leave that top part of it open so that I can slide my journaling tags in and out. Bring back my layout. And you can see now that I've got the photos adhered down, it is a little bit cluttered, but it's okay. It's all right. I'll deal with it. I'm just figuring out to see if I want to add any of these flowers to that title, and I decide that I don't, because I do come back in and add a bit more to my title. So I just wanted to check to make sure that they were going to still fit in there, that I didn't need to add any extra foam, and it's all good. So I'm adding some wet glue to the back of the foam, and then I'm going to stick that down on my layout, and I'm going to give it a little bit of time to dry just so that it's held in place nice and firm. Okay, so I've got these little letter stickers. They're very, very old. They've been in my stash for a really long time. And I'm using them to add some extra title to the top or above and below that word myself. And what my title ends up being is learning to love myself again. And that's what my journaling is about. It is a little bit heavier and deeper than I ordinarily go on my scrapbook layouts, but I think it's still important to tell those stories, and I particularly think ahead to my daughter, and maybe there'll be a time when she's feeling the way that I feel, and having the opportunity to read my thoughts at this time might help her with her own. So I'm using a little bit of wet glue to stick those letters down, which I don't make you watch me do that. And there are my journaling tags, and here is my journaling, which I've printed out on vellum. And I've taken it away and I have sewn the vellum onto those tags, and then I've used a little eyelet to hold them together. I squeezed the eyelet together just a little bit too tightly so they don't open all that easily, but you're still going to be able to read the journaling if you really want to. So now it's the fun stuff. Now it is playing around with all these beautiful florals that I've fussy cut out of that paper. And I did know when I was getting this layout, or when I had this layout in my head, I knew that I wanted to just layer up lots and lots of florals. So almost like it looks like a bouquet or perhaps a garden bed. So I'm not really thinking too much about it. I'm looking for gaps in the floral pieces and then picking something out, adding a little bit of wet glue, and then just tucking it in behind that large floral piece. And yeah, all I'm doing is I'm basically trying to fill in the gaps. I'm not sticking everything down really firmly because I do want it to retain some of that dimension. I'm adding some little foam dots behind this large floral piece to help it to stay popped off the page a little bit. And then I'll also add some foam dots to the larger piece on the bottom for the same reason, just to help it to pop off the page a little bit and give it a little bit more dimension. There were a couple of larger florals that I cut out, and I don't know that any of those make it onto the page. I just couldn't get them to fit in really, so they'll stay in my little mini kit and I will use them on another layout. So I cut this one in half because I didn't need the bottom half of it, and then I end up putting it in two different places or right next to each other. And like I said, I'm just having a look for gaps that I can fill in and using these fussy cut florals to fill in the gaps. So now I'm not going to add as much to the top piece. Sorry for the back of my head there. I'm not adding as much to that top piece because I want that top one to be a little bit smaller because the bottom floral is so big. I just want to make sure that it's balanced, and I don't want that top one to be too big. So I'm just adding a few little pieces just to extend it down a little bit so that it's not floating out there all on its own, and adding a few more foam dots for that dimension. And you can see I've used up just about all of the florals that I fussy cut out. I only cut about half a page out. I knew that I wasn't going to use the entire page, and fussy cutting's not my favorite thing to do. So to finish it off, I've grabbed some of these sequins. They've got glue dots on the back of them. And I'm going to add some pops of black because I'm wearing black in the photo, so I did want to bring that out. So some pops of black using these sequins. At first I started just scattering them around in some of the gaps between the flowers, and then I had the idea of using the larger ones, or using some of the larger ones, to add to the center of the flowers. So you'll see where you can see the center of a flower, I have gone and added one of the black sequins onto that center. And so once I've added all the sequins down, that's it. It was a fun layout to put together. It was really fun to play with florals. And as usual, I've got some close-up photos coming at the end of the video if you'd like to stick around for those. I do have the link in my description box below for all the details on the Mini Kit Monday Challenge group and how you can join in if you would like to. But as always, thank you so much for watching and have a great day.